The dust of the saloon floor puffed up in little clouds around the heels of men who had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. It was the heart of a blistering summer, and the air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. A man named Garrett, whose suit was too fine for the town and whose smile was too wide for his eyes, stood near the bar. He was laying out a series of faded photographs like a hand of cards he couldn't lose. 50 of them, he'd announced, 50 chances for a lonely man to buy himself a wife, shipped in like dry goods. Laughter, coarse and ugly, followed his sales pitch. Men leaned in, pointing with grubby fingers, making crude assessments of jawlines and bosoms. It was a market of flesh, and the currency was loneliness and desperation. Then the batwing doors swung inward, casting a long, imposing shadow that swallowed the room whole. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. It was Abram. He was a man built of mountain rock and pine timber, with a cascade of dark hair and a beard that fell to the center of his chest. He didn't walk into a room, he occupied it, the sheer space he took up demanding respect that his quiet demeanor never asked for. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over the scene with a placid disinterest that was more intimidating than any open threat. Garrett, ever the opportunist, saw not a savage, but a customer. He slicked back his hair and approached the giant. Abram. A man like you shouldn't be alone in those hills. I have just the thing. 50 fine women, from back east. Take your pick. He gestured grandly to his display. Abram's gaze drifted over the photographs of tired-looking women posing stiffly in their Sunday best. He showed no reaction, his face a mask carved from granite. He was about to turn and leave when Garrett, as an afterthought, pulled one last photograph from his inner pocket. It was separate from the others, dog-eared and slightly smaller. And then there's this one, Garrett said, his voice laced with a dismissive sort of intrigue. A bit more exotic. The photograph showed a young woman, hardly more than a girl, with dark, almond-shaped eyes that held a universe of silent sorrow. She was wearing a simple white prairie dress, a stark contrast to her dark hair, and she stood against a bleak backdrop as if she were a ghost already. Abram stopped. He reached out a hand that could have snapped a man's neck and took the small photograph with surprising gentleness. He stared at it for a long, silent moment, the noise of the saloon seeming to hold its breath. Then he looked up, his gaze pinning Garrett to the spot. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep in the earth. Give me the Chinese one. The silence in the saloon shattered, replaced by a wave of snickering and outright guffaws. The men slapped their knees, astounded by the absurdity. But Garrett's smile only widened. He had his sale. Abram was a ghost in his own life, a man haunted not by spirits, but by the deafening silence they had left behind. There was a time when his laughter had echoed in the small cabin nestled high in the alpine meadows, a time when the scent of baking bread and the warmth of a small hand in his were the cornerstones of his world. He had a wife, Sarah, whose smile could rival the summer sun, and a daughter, Lily, whose hair held the same golden light. They were his world, his reason, his everything. Then the fever came, a merciless thief in the night, stealing the warmth from their bodies and the light from their eyes, leaving him in a cold, desolate twilight. He had buried them himself, on a gentle slope overlooking the valley, and with them, he had buried the man he used to be. The town below became a gallery of painful memories. Every corner held a ghost, the general store where he'd bought Lily a ribbon, the riverbank where he and Sarah had picnicked. The pitying glances of the townsfolk were like salt in an open wound. So he retreated, climbing higher into the mountains until the town was just a speck in the distance, until the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the frantic beating of his own broken heart. His cabin became a tomb of memory, a place where he existed but did not live. The silence he had once shared with his family became his tormentor, an ever-present reminder of all he had lost. His journey to the saloon had been a desperate, impulsive act, a flight from the crushing loneliness that had finally become unbearable. He hadn't known what he was looking for, only that the silence had to end. And then he saw her photograph. And Lee. She knew nothing of mountains or fevers, but she understood silence. Her silence was a shield, forged in the fires of betrayal. She had been promised a new life across the ocean, a position as a companion to a wealthy woman in a place called California. Her family had pooled their meager savings, sold precious heirlooms, and sent her off with tears and prayers for her fortune. The promise, however, was a lie spun by a man with a serpent's smile. The journey was a nightmare, the destination a dusty, forgotten town where she was stripped of her name and her dreams, becoming just another face in Garrett's catalogue of misery. She was isolated by her language, her customs, her very appearance. The other women, desperate in their own right, viewed her with suspicion and resentment. She was a curiosity, an oddity, her delicate features and quiet grace marking her as an outsider among outsiders. The white dress she wore was the last remnant of her hope, a symbol of the respectable life she had been promised, now a pale flag of surrender in a hostile land. She waited in a small, stuffy room behind the saloon, listening to the raucous noise, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had become a thing to be bought and sold, and her spirit had retreated deep within, to a place no one could touch. Garrett's oily voice cut through the haze of Unlee's despair. "You're up." Two rough-looking men flanked him, their presence an unspoken threat. She was led from the back room into the main thoroughfare of the saloon, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. A wall of leering, unshaven faces met her gaze. The air, thick with smoke and malice, felt heavy in her lungs. She instinctively pulled her arms around herself, her knuckles white against the fabric of her dress. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist, until they landed on him. He stood near the bar, a mountain of a man who seemed to block out the sun. He was immense, far larger than any man she had ever seen, and a primal fear fluttered in her throat. This was her buyer. This was her fate. The crowd parted as he took a step toward her. Abram didn't look at her body, as the other men did. His gaze met hers, and for a fleeting second, she saw not lust or ownership, but a profound, bottomless sorrow that mirrored her own. It was a flicker of recognition in a sea of hostility, a shared brokenness that was as terrifying as it was unexpected. He turned to Garrett, pulling a worn leather pouch from his belt. With a heavy thud, it landed on the bar, the sound of the gold dust inside silencing the remaining whispers. It was a king's ransom. "Is that enough?" Abram's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Garrett's eyes widened greedily as he snatched the pouch. "More than enough," he smirked, his gaze sliding over Unlee with a renewed sense of possessive regret. "She's all yours. Do with her what you will." Unlee flinched as if struck. The words branded her, cementing her status as property. She saw Abram's jaw tighten, a muscle twitching in his cheek, his massive hand clenching into a fist at his side. He looked as if he might tear Garrett apart, but the moment passed. He took a deep, steadying breath, the storm in his eyes receding. He turned his full attention back to her, the sheer force of his presence making her feel both incredibly small and strangely protected. He didn't reach for her. He simply inclined his head toward the door. "Come," he rumbled. The word was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a current she was powerless to resist. Trembling, Unlee took a hesitant step, then another, following the giant out of the suffocating heat of the saloon and into the blinding light of the afternoon sun. The laughter and jeers from within were a distant, fading sound, like the buzzing of insects. She had been sold. She had been bought. And now, her life belonged to the silent mountain man. The journey began with the crunch of Abram's boots on the dry, dusty earth of the town's main street. He walked ahead of her, a silent, broad-shouldered guide leading her away from the only world she had known for weeks and into an uncertain wilderness. He never once looked back to see if she was following, yet his pace was measured, deliberate, never so fast that her shorter legs couldn't keep up. The punishing summer sun beat down on them, and the white fabric of Unlee's dress soon grew heavy with a fine layer of ochre dust. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear. Every story she had ever been told about the wild men of this new country swirled in her head. Was he a savage? A madman who lived alone for a reason? Would he hurt her? The silence between them was a vast, empty canyon, and she filled it with her worst imaginings. They left the last vestiges of the town behind, the path narrowing as it began its slow, arduous ascent into the foothills. The landscape shifted from sun-scorched plains to rocky inclines dotted with hardy shrubs and twisted, resilient trees. Abram moved through it with an unnerving, familiar grace, his body seemingly molded to the harsh terrain. He was as much a part of this wild place as the hawks circling high above. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped beside a small, clear spring that trickled from a fissure in the rocks. Without a word, he cupped his large hands, filled them with water, and drank deeply. Then he stepped aside, his gesture an unspoken invitation. Hesitantly, Anli knelt by the spring, the cold water a balm on her parched lips. She drank until her thirst was quenched, and when she looked up, she saw that he was watching her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't impatient. He simply waited. As they climbed higher, the air grew cooler, cleaner. The oppressive heat of the lowlands gave way to a refreshing breeze that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The world transformed around them. Towering pines and firs replaced the sparse scrub, their dense canopies creating a cathedral of green and shadow. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in dappled patterns, dancing on the forest floor. The sounds of the world changed too, the distant cry of a bird, the rustle of some unseen creature in the undergrowth, the whisper of the wind through the high branches. It was a world of profound peace and profound isolation. Anli felt as if she were walking off the edge of the map. With every step, the town, her past, and the life she might have had grew more distant, dissolving into memory. She was alone with this strange, silent giant, ascending into the heart of his kingdom, a kingdom of stone, sky, and silence. They arrived at the cabin as dusk was painting the sky in hues of purple and rose. It was nestled in a small meadow, surrounded by a sentinel ring of tall pines, a plume of smoke already rising from its stone chimney. The cabin was not the crude hovel Anli had imagined. It was built of thick, expertly fitted logs, with a sturdy roof and a small, well-tended porch. It looked solid, safe, a bastion against the vast wilderness that surrounded it. Abram pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, holding it for her to follow. The interior was a single, large room, bathed in the warm, flickering glow of a fire already crackling in the hearth. It was meticulously clean. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center, a rough-hewn bookshelf filled with worn volumes stood against one wall, and against the other was a bed, neatly made with a thick quilt. The sight of the single bed sent a fresh spike of fear through her. Abram seemed to read her thoughts. He gestured toward the bed with one large hand. "That is for you," he said, his voice a low murmur that was absorbed by the wooden walls. He then unrolled a thick bear pelt and a woolen blanket near the hearth, creating a simple pallet for himself on the floor. He would not be sharing her bed. A small measure of the tension in her shoulders eased. The first days passed in a ritual of quiet observation. Their lives orbited each other without touching. He would rise before the sun, his movement surprisingly quiet for such a large man, and disappear into the forest with his rifle. He would return hours later with game, which he would prepare with a quiet efficiency. Anli, desperate for purpose, for something to anchor her in this strange new reality, began to explore her small domain. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin and set about weeding and tending to it. She swept the floors, cleaned the single window until it shone, and took over the cooking, transforming his simple rations into flavorful stews using the wild herbs she found growing near the cabin. They rarely spoke. Their communication was one of gestures and actions. He would leave a brace of rabbits by the door, she would leave a bowl of hot stew on the table for his return. One afternoon, she found a small bouquet of purple and yellow wildflowers sitting in a tin cup on the table. She didn't know how to acknowledge the gesture, so she simply left the flowers there until they wilted, a silent testament to a silent kindness. One evening, as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, she noticed a long, jagged tear in the sleeve of his buckskin shirt. The next day, while he was out, she found a needle and thread in a small wooden box and carefully, painstakingly, mended the tear. When he returned, he ran his fingers over the neat stitches, his head bowed, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow crossed his face. That night, as she served him his stew, he looked at her, truly looked at her. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words were a bridge across the chasm of their silence. "You are welcome," she whispered in reply, her own voice sounding foreign in the quiet room. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The air grew heavy and still, the birds fell silent, and a low, ominous rumble echoed through the mountains. A summer storm was coming. Abram secured the shutters and brought in extra firewood, his movements economical and certain. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, he closed the heavy door, plunging the cabin into a warm, firelit intimacy. The storm broke with a vengeance. Rain lashed against the roof, and wind howled around the eaves like a hungry wolf. Brilliant flashes of lightning illuminated the room in stark, momentary detail, followed by cracks of thunder that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Trapped by the tempest, the silence between them became charged, heavy with unspoken words. Anli sat at the table, her hands clenched in her lap, while Abram stood by the hearth, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer in their dance. The firelight carved deep shadows onto his face, highlighting the lines of grief etched around his eyes. A profound, almost unbearable sadness radiated from him, an aura of loss so palpable she could almost touch it. In that moment, he didn't seem like a giant or a savage, he seemed like the loneliest man in the world. A strange, reckless courage bloomed in Anli's chest. She was tired of the fear, tired of the silence. "What do you see in the fire?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper above the roar of the storm. He started, as if pulled from a deep trance. He turned to look at her, and his carefully constructed mask of stoicism crumbled. The sorrow in his eyes was raw, unguarded. He was silent for a long time, the only sounds the storm and the crackling fire. Then, he spoke. His voice was thick with unshed tears. "I see a woman smile," he began, "and I hear a little girl's laughter." He told her everything. He spoke of Sarah, of her kindness and her strength. He spoke of Lily, of her boundless curiosity and the way she would chase butterflies in this very meadow. He told her how he had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, a sanctuary for the family he adored. Then he spoke of the fever, his voice breaking as he recounted his helplessness, watching the 2 lights of his life flicker and die. He had fled to this cabin not to live, but to be buried alongside their memory. The silence, he choked out, it was eating me alive. I went to that town. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just needed a voice in the house. He looked at her then, his gaze filled with a desperate, painful honesty. I chose you because you were different. Because you wouldn't replace them. You were just someone else to share the silence with. The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw. Tears streamed down Anli's face, not for herself, but for him. And in that shared moment of grief, she found her own voice. "My name is Anli," she said softly. She told him of her home across the sea, of her parents and her younger brother. She spoke of the scent of jasmine in her mother's garden, of the bustling markets, of the promises that had turned to dust. For the first time, they were not a buyer and his purchase. They were Abram and Anli, 2 souls shipwrecked by fate, finding a sliver of land in each other's pain. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. The peace that settled over the cabin in the following days was different, deeper. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet understanding. But the world below had not forgotten them. Garrett, back in town, couldn't get the weight of Abram's gold pouch out of his mind. A man who could pay that much for a bride surely had more stashed away. Greed, a persistent and ugly weed, took root in his heart. He began to hear whispers, too, rumors from a trapper who had passed near Abram's land and caught a glimpse of Anli. The trapper spoke of her not as a downtrodden purchase, but as a woman of quiet, ethereal beauty, thriving in the mountain air. Garrett's regret curdled into a venomous new plan. She was worth more than he'd been paid, he reasoned. Far more. He could sell her to the highest bidder in one of the booming mining camps, where desperate men would pay a fortune for such a rare flower. He gathered 2 men, hired muscle whose loyalty was as cheap as the whiskey on their breath, and formulated a pretext. They would ride up to check on the girl's welfare, a benevolent-sounding excuse that masked his foul intentions. Their arrival at the cabin was a violation. They rode their horses straight into the meadow, trampling the wildflowers. The sound of their coarse laughter and the clink of their spurs was an obscenity in the tranquil air. Abram was chopping wood nearby, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat in the quiet afternoon. He stopped, axe in hand, as the three men dismounted. And Lee, who had been tending to her garden, froze, the color draining from her face. Garrett tipped his hat with a mocking flourish, his eyes devouring Lee. "Well, well, Abram," he drawled, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Seems the mountain air agrees with her. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by, make sure you were treating my property right." The word property hung in the air like a poison. Abram's knuckles were white around the handle of his axe. He said nothing, his body a study in coiled tension. Garrett ignored him, taking a step toward Lee. "You're looking even prettier than I remembered," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "Too pretty for a place like this. A girl like you could have a fine life, a life with silks and jewels." Down in the camps his meaning was clear and ugly. He was not here for a social call. He was here to collect his merchandise. The peaceful sanctuary they had built was about to become a battleground. "She is not your property," Abram said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of the mountain itself. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the air, a promise of violence held in check by a thread. Garrett just laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I have a bill of sale that says otherwise, you hermit. You paid for her, sure, but I'm thinking I undersold. The market's gone up." He gestured to his two hired thugs, who fanned out, their hands hovering near the pistols at their hips. "So, here's the deal. You give me another pouch of that gold, a bigger one this time, and I'll forget I ever saw her. If not..." He let the threat hang in the air, his gaze once again falling on Lee with a look of vile ownership. "She's worth a hell of a lot more in the mining camps." That was the final line. Something inside Abram, some long-dormant beast of righteous fury, awoke. He was no longer the grieving widower, the quiet recluse. He was a protector. He dropped the axe and took a step forward, placing himself squarely between Garrett's men and Lee. The sheer scale of him was terrifying. He seemed to swell, to grow even larger, a force of nature about to be unleashed. "Leave," he commanded, the word a stone dropped into a silent pool. One of the thugs, emboldened by Garrett's confidence, drew his pistol. "He says we gotta take the girl," the man sneered. Abram moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. Before the thug could even aim, Abram's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol clattered to the ground as the man screamed. Abram didn't even glance at him. He spun, his other arm sweeping out and catching the second thug across the chest, sending him flying backward to land in a heap 10 feet away, gasping for air. It was over in seconds. The display of raw, brutal power was so swift, so absolute, that Garrett was left frozen in stunned silence, his face pale with shock and sudden, dawning fear. Abram turned his full attention to him, his eyes now the color of a thunderhead, blazing with a cold, terrifying light. He took another slow step forward, and Garrett scrambled backward, stumbling over his own feet. "She is not a thing," Abram growled, his voice resonating with a power that seemed to come from the earth beneath his feet. "She is my wife. Now get off my mountain before I tear you apart and feed you to the wolves." The threat was not an idle one. Garrett, his bravado utterly shattered, saw the promise of a violent end in Abram's eyes. He saw a man who had lost everything once and would not, could not, lose again. Without another word, he turned and fled, scrambling onto his horse with clumsy, panicked movements. He helped the man with the broken wrist into his saddle, leaving the other thug to stagger after them as they galloped away, a disorderly retreat of cowards from a battle they had profoundly misunderstood. The sound of their hoofbeats faded, and an intense, ringing silence descended upon the meadow once more. But this was a new kind of silence, charged and electric, humming with the aftermath of the confrontation. Lee stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had seen Abram's grief, his kindness, his sorrow. But she had never seen this. This raw, primal power. This terrifying, beautiful ferocity. He had stood as a wall between her and the ugliness of the world. He turned to face her, the fury slowly draining from his features, replaced by an expression of deep concern. His chest was still heaving, and his eyes searched hers, not for gratitude, but for fear. He was worried that his violence had terrified her, that he had become the monster she had once imagined him to be. She saw the vulnerability beneath the warrior, the question in his gaze. And in that moment, all her remaining fear of him dissolved, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was something more. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, until she was standing directly in front of him. Her eye scanned his form and noticed a long, bloody scrape on his forearm where the second thug had brushed against him. Without thinking, she reached out and gently laid her fingers on his arm, just below the wound. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched him. Abram went completely still, his entire massive frame freezing at the light pressure of her hand. He looked down at her small fingers on his skin as if he'd never seen such a thing before. He had defended her, fought for her, and now her touch was unmaking him. "You called me your wife," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Her eyes lifted to meet his. He held her gaze, and the last vestiges of the storm in his eyes cleared, leaving only a deep, clear, and achingly tender light. The mountain man, the grieving giant, was gone. In his place was just Abram, a man looking at a woman who was fast becoming his entire world. "I meant it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. And in the quiet of the mountain meadow, with the scent of pine and trampled wildflowers in the air, a transaction made in a dusty saloon was finally, irrevocably, transformed into a promise. The last weeks of summer unfolded in a golden haze. The days remained warm, but the nights grew cooler, carrying the first crisp promise of autumn. A new rhythm settled into the cabin, a harmony of shared lives no longer orbiting but intertwined. The space between Abram and Anli was now filled with a comfortable, easy intimacy. The short, weighted sentences of their early days gave way to longer conversations by the fire. He told her stories of the mountain, of the habits of the deer and the flight of the eagle. She, in turn, told him more of her home, painting vivid pictures of a life he could barely imagine, of festivals and family traditions, her voice weaving a tapestry of a world far from this quiet, rustic sanctuary. The invisible wall between them had crumbled completely. His touch, which she had once feared, became a source of comfort. A hand on the small of her back as she reached for something on a high shelf, his fingers brushing hers as he passed her a cup of water. Each small contact was a reaffirmation of the bond forged in the heart of the storm. One evening, he returned from the forest not with game, but with his hands full of late-blooming fireweed, its vibrant magenta a shock of color against the green landscape. He didn't just leave them in a cup this time. He stood before her and offered them, a silent, heartfelt gift. She took them, her fingers tracing the delicate petals, and she smiled at him, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes and lit her entire face. It was the first time he had seen such a smile from her, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was more beautiful than any sunrise he had ever witnessed over the peaks. He was a man who had fled the world to escape his ghosts, and in his desperate flight, he had stumbled upon a new reason to live. He found the world not in the busy streets of a town, but in the quiet strength and gentle spirit of one woman. Anli, who had been treated as a nameless object, a piece of exotic merchandise, had found her voice, her home, and her strength in the steady, protective presence of a man who saw not what she was, but who she was. Their cabin, once a monument to a past steeped in grief, was now a sanctuary for a future blooming with hope. They stood on the small porch as the sun dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold. His arm was wrapped securely around her shoulders, and she leaned into his strength, her head resting against his chest. They watched the day end, together, two solitary souls who had found their harbor in each other. And as you watch them there, in the fading light, you might wonder if sometimes, the most beautiful things can grow from the harshest soil, and that even in the deepest silence, a heart can learn to sing again.